talking about centuries of violence. And so to think that we can just undo it so quickly means that we will come up with really hasty decisions and frameworks that won't last. And so I'm on the intergenerational plan. We have to use speculative fiction, and that is what marginalized communities have done. That when enslaved people said, "My people will be free," they didn't see where we are now, but they knew that, and they carried it for generations. And I don't even have children, but my children's children will not know what sexual violence is. They will read about it and go, "Oh, people used to do that." And that's what I want. That's what I'm working towards.
Welcome back to Unbroken Chain. I'm Maura James, and this is Love with Accountability with Aishah Shahidah Simmons. I think this episode continues the conversation really beautifully from last week. Aishah self-identifies as a Black feminist lesbian, and she's also a documentary filmmaker. She made No, the rape documentary, and several shorts about the Black feminist lens, which are on Vimeo. And she's also an incest and child sexual abuse and young adult rape survivor. And she's really made her journey in understanding and healing that her life's work. As much as she is such a force and such a light in this space, she uplifts the voices of those who have come before her and those who are doing work in communion with her with such integrity. She's putting out an anthology this fall, which is now available for pre-order, which is called Love with Accountability, Digging Up the Roots of Child Sexual Abuse. And you can find that at lovewithaccountability.com. I was called to talk to Aishah because she has the potency and lived experience of child sexual assault. And right now, I feel like there are so many conversations coming up in so many spaces about how pervasive child sexual assault and adult sexual assault is, and the fact that because we are not confronting it culturally, we are now seeing the traumatic fallout from that on a huge scale. And what I love about Aishah is that she has taken that culture of shame and secrecy and normalizing, and she is examining it on the individual level. She's doing such potent, challenging work with her family members, and then zooming out and seeing what that looks like at scale. How we become a healthy culture that really understands accountability on all levels. And there's a deep need for that in this country specifically. And I don't think it's a surprise that on an individual level, many of us don't really know what it means to be accountable to our family members and to ourselves. It's not modeled. It's not a particularly American value. And Aishah's work is such an incredible example of how transformative, radically transformative accountability can be individually and together. So if you're someone that has experienced sexual trauma, either as a child or as an adult, or if you're someone that hasn't, but you acknowledge that harm has been done to you in your childhood, in your young adulthood, and that affects the way that you harm others, for anyone who's ready to start asking what Aishah so clearly asks, where in my life do I need to be accountable? This conversation is for you, for all of us who are truly committed to transforming ourselves and thereby the world. I'm so grateful for the wisdom that she is sharing by making her story, her very personal, very intimate story, accessible to so many through her films and her books and her lecturing. There's so much transformative justice possible. This is really deep love work. We're all invited in. Here is Aishah.
Well, accountability is not punishment, though it definitely can feel like punishment when you've caused harm or when you've been able to do something and no one calls you on it or invites you in as opposed to calling you out to really address it. And it is a way to first and foremost make amends if you're able, and to explore with the person whom you've caused harm ways in which you can address the harm that you've caused. So accountability does require that the person who's caused harm, that they acknowledge that they've caused harm. You can't really have accountability if you're saying, well, I didn't do anything. That is a key component. It's like a partnership of sorts, right? Where the person who's caused harm has every right to be like, I don't want to be involved, I don't want to talk to you, whatever. But if it is possible to be able to engage in how can we right the wrongs? And a lot of times it's not paying back, it's paying forward, starting with the person with whom you've caused the harm, but also hopefully looking at ways to modify and change your behavior.
You just said there's a difference between calling out and inviting in, which I really like. What is that?
Yeah, and I feel like the first time I heard that was by my friend who's writer, Black gay male activist Darnell Moore, and now Loretta Ross, who is a mentor and just incredible activist. She has a book called Calling In, the Calling Out Culture. And basically, rather than kind of calling out or putting somebody out on Front Street, right, which to me signifies shame and blame, that you invite people in, you invite them in to think about behavior modification so that it is a place where someone necessarily isn't shamed. They're held accountable, but in a way in which that invites them in to really change. I think that a lot of time when we call people out, and have called lots of people out, and I have been called out, it does require a stance of like not being on the defensive or defending outrageous behavior, rather than if you're inviting in and saying, hey, we need to talk about this, that I think that it can create some breathing space for a person to reflect and go, wow, that was messed up, or I'm really sorry.
Does that then change somebody that's experienced abuse? Does that change their experience of healing to be participating with an abuser?
You know, I don't want to do a blanket statement. What I want to do is I can talk about my experiences with my mother, who did not sexually abuse me, though she knew, along with my father, about the sexual harm that I experienced as a child, because I told her at 10 years old that my grandfather I didn't say he was sexually molesting me, but that's what he was doing. I talked about some of the things that he was doing to my body. And initially I wasn't believed, and then at some point maybe I was believed, but nothing was done to take me out of the situation. And it did stop after 2 years, though there was no announcement that this is the last time. So hindsight tells me that it stopped. I didn't know it was going to stop. So I was always afraid, right? Is he going to come in the room? Is he going to try to kiss me in the basement? Like all the things that he did. So that was 10 to 12, and then he became gravely ill when I was 39. So from 12 to 39, I engaged with Pop, whom I loved very much, who I also was upset about the harm that he caused, and was afraid, and never addressed it, never confronted him. My parents never did anything. And then I say he was in a very gravely ill situation where I played a role in saving his life and being by his side initially until my father, who lives in Europe, and my aunt were able to get here. And then it was at that point that I was just like, no more. Okay, so that was 2010. Fast forward to 2015, when I think things really came to a head, where I just realized, and my grandfather died in 2011, and I did not go to his funeral. But what I realized was that I always thought I was protecting my grandfather. And even though I would identify as an incest survivor, I would say, my name is Aishah Shahidah Simmons, I'm an incest survivor, I never talked about it because I thought I was protecting him. But then I realized, no, I was protecting my parents, because my parents are really remarkable and dedicated human rights activists who have put their lives on the line in civil rights movements. That's where they met in the 60s. My father's a conscientious objector to the Vietnam War, where he served 30 months in prison. My mother's done a lot of work around women's rights under Islamic law. She is a Muslim and an Islamic scholar. My father does work on trafficking. I mean, I joke, but I said I was conceived on a picket line. So I was raised in struggle. And I was also raised to protect family. But family is really them, because what does it really mean for them to save the world or work to save the world, and yet essentially sacrifice their daughter in the name of that? Because my parents are divorced and have been divorced since I was 4, but my grandparents created this home, this safe space for me where I spent a lot of my time. And so I started in 2015 sending very fiery, angry, calling out, let me say, not calling in, texts and emails demanding love with accountability, just kind of signing it, love with accountability. Basically saying, I love you all, but you all have to be accountable. And then Jennifer Patterson, the editor of Queering Sexual Violence, Radical Movements from Within the Sexual Violence Movement, had invited me to contribute to her anthology. This was this was right around when my grandfather became ill. And I actually wrote a piece for the anthology. And the piece that I wrote was okay, but it wasn't the full truth because I was still protecting my parents. And while that was all happening, it was in 2015, I reached out to Jenny and I was like, I can't use what I've given you. Because I was like, I'd rather not be in it than live a lie. And so as fate would have it, I was able to rewrite the piece, and it's called Removing the Mask, because I really realized that I had been wearing a mask for so many years. It was a process upon process upon process. And 2016, my mother finally came to grips with the fact that she didn't protect me. I mean, the narrative was they both were like, we said we're sorry, and I was like, yeah, that's 79 to 81, but we got to talk about 81 to 2010. We have to talk about the holiday dinners, the family gatherings. My grandmother had Alzheimer's for the last 10 years of her life, so from the time I was about 19 to 30 or so. And my grandfather took care of her around the clock. I mean, she never set foot in a nursing home, and it's because of him. So he's like Hero, right? Hero who does, the unthinkable for many people. They're like, why? I'm not going to deal with it. And so even engaging in that way, like seeing my grandmother and taking care of my grandma and still dealing with my grandfather. So my mom really began to face what I'm sure as a non-parent, but I can imagine the unfaceable. And so that started our own love with accountability work, and she actually wrote for the first time about this, about it, and I did an online forum in 2016, a 10-day love with accountability forum, of which the anthology kind of comes out of. So I can say that work that my mother and I have been doing, and it's been a lot of starts and stops and hard. It's been hard for both of us, and periods of no talking. I mean, last year I went through a period of just silence, not any communication. So it's not like a walk in the park. But with that work, to be seen, to be heard, to be acknowledged by someone who was in deep denial, and to a point where both my parents were trying to make it seem like I was the problem because I kept demanding. I can't even articulate the healing, the seismic healing. It's happening. I mean, we can't undo what didn't happen for 37 years, but I just feel the healing happening, molecularly.
I imagine for all that time to not be able to fully own the story of what had happened, that it can't move through it if you're resisting the truth of it. So being able to talk about it seems like sort of the very first fundamental step to any kind of healing for any kind of violence or abuse.
Yeah. It's got to be hard. I mean, I just think about harm that I've caused to specifically thinking about my brother, who's 9 years younger than me. He's my father's son, not my mom's. But I just say that because there's all these tentacles, right? I think about harm that I've caused him in response, just in terms of being angry and mean. He was 1 when my molestation started, right? And so, and I bring up him being my father's son and not my mother, because it was just this whole kind of integration. So it's in the place where I was molested. So it's that family, my paternal family. Here he's the new kid, he's the baby, he's all of that, right? So then I'm already feeling misplaced on some level, and then I'm also being molested. So it's just And I can't hold my parents accountable at 10, 11, and 12. And so thinking about how that has played out in so much of our life. So my work in trying to be accountable to him and initiating the accountability, he did not. And in fact, I think it was through the work with my parents and looking at how they initially weren't being accountable. And I was like, well, where in my life do I need to be accountable? Where in my family? And I was like, oh my God, my brother, let alone relationships with friends. I mean, we cause harm. I mean, there's the vast spectrum of harm. And I've put sexual harm and murder on one end, but that still, harm is harm. It is hard. And particularly when you have a certain image of yourself or how you want to be in the world. And I have to look at the fact, oh my God, I did this. And this is not how I see myself. This is not who I want to be.
Man, and hearing you talk, I can just hear the level of accountability that you're holding yourself to in order to be able to do the work that you are publicly and for other people. I can just tell that you've had to investigate yourself so deeply, which is really intense work.
It is. It is intense work. And it's still, I feel like it's still unfolding. There's still unanswered questions and it's still ongoing, and I'm still causing harm. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, not like I wake up every day and I'm like, I'm going to cause harm, but what is such a slippery slope is those of us who are viewed as kind of leaders, survivor leaders, or experts, or whatever, in whatever field, that you can easily forget that you're still learning. I feel like, you're still learning, that you haven't arrived. I don't think we ever fully arrive. Maybe some highly evolved spiritual being whom I've yet to meet in this lifetime. I think that we're constantly learning. So I just want to say, yes, I'm doing a lot of work and it's ongoing. And I still kind of fall down and got to get myself back up and think about it.
You must have some pretty serious practices to help you.
I try. I've been sitting Vipassana meditation courses taught in the tradition of Essen Goenka since 2002. So you have to take a 10-day course to learn the technique in this tradition. And then after that, there are 3-day and 1-days. But I've also taken 20-day and 30-day courses. And it's a very austere in the Theravada tradition, but it deeply resonates with me. There's no talking, no music. It's just silent meditation, 12 hours a day. And I think what's also very powerful is that these courses are operated on donation only, so that you can never pay for yourself. You can only pay for it. And when I took my first course in 2002, I was working on my film No, and I didn't have any money. My friend Wadia Gardiner, she paid my transportation up there. Another friend, Sharon Mullally, who's the editor of No, she loaned me a sleeping bag. I mean, that's just where I was, because everything was going into the making of this film. And, you could give a donation. I didn't even have a donation to give. But I did have time. And so then I started serving courses. For me, that resonates. I mean, I think that there are many powerful traditions that do incredible work. I have a lot of friends who sit in various different lineages based on the teachings of Buddha. And then I just can't even imagine where I'd be without therapy, without the work with my therapist, Dr. Clara Whaley Perkins, who I have been seeing since 1992. So to work with someone for so long so that she can actually point out, oh, this sounds like this or this looks like that. And also another just goddess sin in my life when I had no money, which was a big part of my life, barely making it because everything was going to No, and I didn't have a full-time traditional job. Dr. Whaley Perkins made her services available to me. She did not allow what was in my bank account to determine if she would give me services. So that is just priceless. Expert psychological support by a Black feminist woman who specializes in trauma. And then just being in community with other survivors, really feeling a need to lift up my cousin Marie Ali. I lift up Marie because we are first cousins, paternal cousins, our fathers are brothers. We support each other on our journeys. And one of the things that Marie really gifted me was years ago was asking me how was I able to do it. And that was essentially what she was asking about, wearing the mask, like going to Nana and Pop-Pop's house and all of this. She was just like, how are you functioning? And I don't even know where I put all that stuff in my head. And it was like, that was the first time when she was like, the emperor's naked. And I couldn't even respond. I couldn't answer. I was defensive and crying. And because I think I just compartmentalized it and was like, this is what I have to do. And so for her to just kind of say, what are you doing? It was just like, what? It didn't happen overnight, but I feel like those seeds were planted. And I finished No in '06, and here we are in 2019. I feel like I'm in an embryonic stage around my child sexual abuse healing, right? So I was raped my sophomore year in college, and there's a lot of trauma connected to that. But I can't touch the CSA. And I think what has been powerful is that there are times when I felt like I was near on, almost over the edge when I was like facing my child sexual abuse, was that by the time that I was really tackling it, I had like a lot of time in with therapy and meditation. So I feel like even when I feel like, oh my God, what's going on? Like I have tools that I can fall back on, that I'm just not out there without any support network. Having a really, and it's new, it's when I say new in terms of the whole scheme of my life, but a very supportive partner, Sheila Alexander Reed. It means something to have someone who can hold you literally and figuratively, because so many things, particularly now, like it's like surviving R. Kelly, leaving Neverland, and woo, it's a lot. And like I said, I do this work. I've been doing this work since 1994, and that stuff wipes me out.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because I feel like the idea of being triggered has sort of, it's easy to blow off. It's being used in a really off-the-cuff way now, but like that's a real somatic reaction that you're having.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry that I don't remember people's names in terms of the survivors' names in Surviving R. Kelly, but there was a survivor who went back to the house where she lived in Atlanta, and you could just you saw it. And when I watched that, I started crying and wailing, not just crying, like wailing. And I remember I was at my partner's home, we're in a long-distance relationship, and I remember running into the bedroom, just sobbing uncontrollably. And for me, definitely I was sad for that survivor. I want to be very clear. But what came up for me was like, oh my God, this is a grown woman who got involved with R. Kelly as a grown woman and was abused and has PTSD, doesn't even want to go back in the house. The house is not even what it was. It's like an empty house. I was abused as a child from 10 to 12, and that house still exists. It is a house that I have recently gone to, and yes, these people are ancestors, but it's still pretty much the same house. And nobody has ever checked for me. Are you okay? Have you thought about it? So I've started wailing for that girl, that young woman, that 40-something-year-old woman. Like when I could see her trauma and how she could not stay in the house and how she had to get out of that room. And I was like, how have I been able to do it? And I just started wailing for little Aishah, but also big Aishah. I was watching this thing objectively. Like I wasn't thinking, oh, what about, and it just came up out of nowhere. A similar thing happened during Dr. Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, while I'm watching, and she's talking about a rape that happened when she was 15 and was very clear, and it happened one time. She never had to see him again. And then I was like, oh my God, but I saved his life, like all these things. So it was just, it's terror. And you just don't know what could trigger, because I've seen stuff that doesn't bother. Like I can look at no all day long, and there are many people who can't look at no at all. So it's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, and I also have noticed too that the idea of child sexual abuse is often relegated to the idea of sort of like the creepy pedophile that like moves down the block.
Sick of that.
But it seems like that, yeah, exactly. So much of what you're saying is like it's happening in families
all the time. It's 42 million, and that is that's not based on those who have not reported. Like I didn't report, so I'm not part of that 42 million. And so then let's assume if it's just one per one, right? So then that's 42 million people who've caused harm. And then we have to think about all the people who know about the harm that's been, like, for instance, I told, or people who suspect and look the other way. So no, it's very pervasive, and we don't talk about it. And I think we don't talk about it because of how pervasive it is. And it's just like with rape. We project this strange, unidentifiable man in the bushes, or the creepy guy in the van driving who's going to yank your kid, and trafficking is real and we have to talk about. And what I find is interesting is that whenever I say I'm working on child sexual abuse, people go to trafficking. It's not that it's easy to talk about, I want to be very clear, but it's still the outsider getting the child to do this, right? We don't want to talk about the insider person. And I think part of that is because it's complicated. Like I said, my grandfather was a hardworking man. He was a union man. He was a race man. He took care of his wife for 11 years. Just when they were retiring, they were making plans to possibly move to Florida, do all these amazing things. And she started going downhill. He didn't say, well, the heck with that, I'm gonna live he took care of her around the clock. So this is the same man who took the night away from me as a kid. So how do we hold all of that? And I think that that's part of the reason why we need the creep.
The boogeyman.
Right,
yeah.
the boogeyman. I mean, definitely R. Kelly and Harvey Weinstein and Bill Cosby, and these folks have to be held accountable. But I think it becomes easy to focus on them, right, than to think about the folks in our lives who've committed these harms. Because it's like Bill Cosby's in jail, and I'm definitely a prison abolitionist. I don't know what's going to happen with Weinstein or Kelly. I'm not safe because Bill Cosby's in jail. So when we're like, it's a victory, who is the victory for?
Yes.
You know, and those are things that I think, you know, we have to deal with.
Who is it a victory for? Like, is this still serving the system?
I do believe that victim survivors should determine, I think that they should have a say in what they want to happen, right? And I recognize that there are some victim survivors, including those who are against the criminal justice system, feel like this is all we have right now, right? So I don't want to shame or blame folks who press charges against the people who've caused them harm. I also know, and I credit the work of the organization Survived and Punished, Insight, Women and Trans People of Color Against Violence, that without some form of community accountability and stuff, that people, or when people defend themselves, right? Because they're like, well, if somebody did this to me, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z. What we know, in Miriam Kaba, there's an edited anthology that talks about no selves to defend, about how cisgender and transgender women of color, we don't have a right to defend ourselves. Because defending ourselves usually means that we end up in jail. We can look at Marissa Alexander. We can look at Brescia Meadows. We can look at C.C. McDonald. I was about to say C.C. Carter, who's an amazing poet, a Black lesbian poet, but no, C.C. McDonald. There are many, many examples of how when we defend ourselves against violence, against intimate partner violence, that we are penalized. So just this notion of defending ourselves it doesn't work in our favor. I think that Bill Cosby being in jail, it serves something, and I'm not sure for whom. And I'm not talking about the survivors. Clearly, they feel vindicated, and I want to honor their vindication. And at the same time, it's like, what does it mean? Because Bill Cosby couldn't have done what he did alone. R. Kelly couldn't have done what he did alone. Michael Jackson couldn't have done what he did alone. So, I mean, they definitely committed the acts. But they become the fall guy. What about NBC? What about, and all of these kinds, and even now, Sony's dropping R. Kelly from their catalog. It's kind of easy to do that now. Where were you in the 90s when he was making lots of money? He's not making lots of money for you. He's a liability for you now. Let's be real. Or even Larry Nassar, the Olympic gym doctor, in terms of all of the accounts and him going to jail. The committee knew, the Olympic committee knew, people looked the other way. So we keep focusing on that one person. And I'm very informed by my own lived experiences, right? Yes, what Pop-Up did was wrong. It was egregious. It was outrageous. So there's no doubt in my mind. And I don't think that there's any way that my parents could have predicted that he was going to do it. But then when it was brought to their attention, they become complicit.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what do we do with that? And as a CSA survivor, I wouldn't have wanted Pop-Up to go to jail. I damn sure wouldn't have wanted my parents to go to jail. I wouldn't have wanted to be put in foster care. This is why we have to think about how we can address this. And putting the survivors first, centering the survivors, I want to be clear, but address it in a way that is holistic and not going to create more damage and harm, because we know that children are abused in the foster system.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about this, and I want to be really careful to not, like, what I'm saying is obviously not like if you are abused as a child, then you become a child abuser. But in something that you were writing about Michael Jackson recently, you were trying to make the point that, like, there's a much bigger context for these things, and that, it's that hurt people idea. So it feels like that's sort of a part of what you're bringing to the table in terms of other modes of justice, is like looking back up the chain at what's happened in previous generations and like what's happened to the abusers, which, I mean, is like tremendously compassionate and just blows me away in terms of the work that you're doing.
Yeah. I used to say, well, I've been abused and I'm not abusing anybody. I'm not sexually abusing anyone, though I've caused harm, right? And I feel like I've caused harm. I've caused harm. There's like, that should be a period. Thinking about my own family stuff, like thinking about the backdrop of what was going on. I understand. Doesn't mean it was okay.
Right.
I understand certain things. And I believe Leaving Neverland. And I think that I think it's horrific what Michael Jackson was accused of doing by Wade Robson and Jimmy Safechuck, not to mention all the people who were not interviewed, right? But I think the filmmaker did a disservice, and I'm sure there's probably legal questions. I'm sure there's a lot connected to not talk about, like, this is somebody, who not only was a prodigy, but was robbed of a childhood. This is somebody whose sister came forward in the 80s maybe and talked about that she was a sexual abuse survivor. LaToya Jackson came out around that, and I remember thinking she was crazy because that was the narrative. Mind you, I was a survivor, but again, deep denial. And so I just can't help but wonder, did he, if not in his family, but on the road, or did he experience sexual harm? So these are questions. It doesn't condone what he did, but it's like, where do we start with the harm, right? So we have to address the most immediate harm. So these children or this person has been harmed by this person. So we got to deal with that. And then, though, why did this person cause harm? Because I don't believe that we are born here causing harm. I don't think that we come to the planet causing harm.
Yeah.
And so what were the circumstances that created an environment where this person felt like they had to cause harm? And then whoever caused harm to that person, like, this is that intergenerational stuff. How do we look at that? And I feel like our criminal justice system, our society, we don't have space and time to do that. This person caused harm, put them in jail. As opposed to, like, really kind of unfolding and going, what's going on here? And then in terms of, like, these celebrities, what we allow celebrities to do, for hopefully a chance at fame or being an auxiliary to fame. It's really interesting. So I think that hurt people cause hurt people. It doesn't mean, like, that it mirrors exactly the same thing, but I do think that, we all have coping mechanisms. And I think that those are things that I struggled with that film, in a way in which, at least with Surviving R. Kelly, they do give us some background. And they're not saying that it was okay what he did. Right. You just know that these things happened to him. And I think that that's an important context. It's clear. I watched the interviews. He's so, either he's the greatest actor on earth, or he is so unaware. And I think that I hold all those people around him who have not made him aware that what he's doing is harm.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I feel like at one point one of the women said something along the lines of, like, he's not aware of when his generosity crossed over and became control. Like, she was able to see that he, in his own capacity, mental, emotional capacity, just didn't understand that. And yeah, doesn't make it okay, like you're saying. But yeah, I was going to ask you about institutions and sort of why institutions seem to protect predators. But I feel like you've kind of answered that already in what you're talking about, because it seems pretty much like what we're talking about is money, and that people will do anything to benefit from capitalist structures. And I guess, where we are culturally right now, is that just because that is so much of our value? Is that what we're seeing in the church, in the entertainment industry? Is it just all a microcosm of the bigger problematic hetero male white patriarchy?
Well, I think we have to look at the origins. I mean, this country was founded on rape. It was founded on rape of people, of men, women, gender non-binary, children, girls and boys. It was founded on that, of indigenous people, of enslaved African people, theft of land. Like, so when I talk about going back, like the very fabric of not only this nation, but the Americas, from Alaska on down to, Argentina, like that is what this is founded on, right? Now, it's not only that, because if that were the case, then we'd be the only hemisphere where this is going on, right? Like, so it's happening all over the world. But I think that we have to think about that. Many of the sacred texts talk about, in some instances, I would offer, unless you have a feminist or womanist lens, condone sexual violence in terms of the Quran, the Torah, the Bible. I mean, that there's instances of it. So I think that there's a lot of excavation and a lot of work.
What's going on there? I guess those were written by people that had something to gain from...
Well, that I don't know. I am not a religious scholar. I mean, I'm a daughter of one and niece of another one, like people and very good friends, and grateful for the work that folks are doing around looking at that. And I have a colleague in my fellowship cohort, Ahmad Green Hayes, who has an organization called Children of Kambahi, which is really looking at CSA in the Black church specifically. It's just a church. We're not dealing with the mosque or the synagogue. So, I mean, I just think that there are people who are looking at that work. So I don't know what's going on, but I do think that it would do us a disservice to not also look at all of that. We're all products of all of these things, right? So, and particularly in this country, we don't even want to tell true history in so many instances. So if we can't do that, then how do we even expect to deal with it in terms of sexual violence? I mean, like, we want to be so upset about this person lying, or he's not telling the truth, or she's not telling the truth. And I'm like, what is the example, right? And particularly now with what's going on in D.C., like what's going on with, in terms of the leader of this country. I mean, there's just so much who mocks survivors, who says it's okay. Like, so what are we doing here?
Yeah. Do you feel a tide changing? Do you feel like Me Too is real change? Because you were saying this is the 25th anniversary of this film. Like, you've been working on this for a really long time.
Yeah. I mean, I think that I feel like through the work of Me Too and specifically the visibility and leadership of Tarana Burke as a Black woman survivor who has been doing Me Too work for a very long time before the hashtag and all of the explosion that happened 2 years ago. I think that there is energy and highlighting of a Black woman, and then by extension other Black women, like that's been profound. I mean, so many of us, and I have been doing this work for so long and not seen or recognized. I mean, I think about, I don't know if Surviving R. Kelly would even exist.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like, for Black women survivors' stories to be national news and coverage and to even play a role and have impact, that's huge. When I was making No, and from 94 to 2006, I never in my wildest dreams thought that I would see something like this. So to be able to live and see that, and to hear the voices of Black women who are doing this work. I think about another colleague in my cohort, the Just Beginnings Collaborative cohort, Amita Swadin, who's specifically looking at child sexual abuse in queer and trans people of color communities, because without question, they have the high, and I am a queer woman, I'm a lesbian, but just in terms of the queer community of color, highest percentage of sexual violence happening to them as children. And so just raising that visibility, particularly trans and gender nonconforming, that they tend to be the most vulnerable, more than girls, cis girls, and boys. And, nobody wants to get into a hierarchy of who's the most oppressed, but I think it's really important because there is this kind of narrative, and I mean, I know Noah's played a part of that, right, of like sexual violence only is happening against cis women, cisgender women, by cisgender men. And so over time, my whole understanding and perspective and viewpoint has been really expanded expanded to see that, no, this doesn't know any boundaries. And I think that is evident in my work with the anthology, to really include a chorus of voices of cis and trans and gender non-binary people who have been impacted by child sexual abuse and who are also working to end it outside of the criminal justice apparatus that has harmed Black communities.
And you're making a point that I'm glad you're making, that I just want to echo too, that white women have been problematic in this as well for a very long time, and that the work that Black women specifically have been doing has been, they've been overcoming serious like roadblocks by white women. So I think we are all indebted to Black women for where we are right now. And your film does a really beautiful job talking about that. Especially there's a part where you were talking about how, you know, how many Black men were killed because they supposedly violated white women, and how many Black women have been violated by Black or white men who have just never, that is just not a narrative that is ever discussed. And I know there's a lot of wisdom in that lineage. It's awful that it's come this way, but yeah, we're definitely all benefiting from the work that you've been doing for generations. So,
well, no, I feel like there's a continuum, and I think that is what's really important in these moments is for people to understand that no exists because of the work that precedes it and the work that precedes it, you know, and that was something that the film intentionally looks at enslavement, goes from enslavement of African people in this country through present day. And really, for me, No was, I feel like, two documentaries in one. It's really kind of looking at Black history through a Black feminist lens and revisiting these key marker points that is usually told through a masculine lens, and then also talking about breaking silence around sexual violence. So to revisit Reconstruction and lynching, but really lifting up Ida Wells Burnett and the anti-lynching crusaders, to revisit the SNCC and Black Power movements, and hear from Elaine Brown, the only woman to lead the Black Panther Party. My mother, Dr. Gwendolyn Zahar Simmons, who was one of two project directors during the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And it's really important to say that at that time my mother was 19. I'm sure Elaine was in her very early 20s. Like, this is like young adult leadership and just the power of that then and even now, that just this kind of notion that you have to have all this experience to be able to make radical and revolutionary change. And so for me, it was very important to lift these voices. Loretta Ross, who was like the third director of one of the oldest rape crisis centers in this country, the DC Rape Crisis Center, and, you know, lifting up the work of Barbara Smith and Ntozake Shange and Alice Walker with The Color Purple and For Colored Girls, like really talking about just this evolution of how we got here. And while simultaneously talking about sexual violence in our community, looking at how rape has been used as a weapon of homophobia, that when either queer or presumed straight Black women or any woman speak out against patriarchy, against misogyny, against rape culture, the first thing historically, I think it's shifting a little bit, to do to shut her down is to call her a lesbian. And so that becomes a way to separate folks and to really challenge that and challenge that narrative in the film through the testimonies of folks who've been on those front lines.
I feel like you made the point too in was it Silence Broken, your first film?
Yeah.
That as a queer Black woman specifically, you sort of have this perspective outside the mainstream that allows you to do this work in a way that really is intersectional, because it can't be parceled out into like it's just about sex or it's just about gender identity. And so I'm wondering if your self-identity has that been lifelong, or is that something that you've
Yeah,
come to?
I think growing up, my mother was the first Black feminist that I met. Literally. And my father, he talked about and supported Black feminist principles, at least in terms of how I was taught. And so I never saw my gender, I never was caught in the middle between my race and gender. And I feel like I have benefited from that, from the generation that precedes me, of Black feminists. And I feel really fortunate for that, because I know that there are a lot of people my age where that's not their lived experience. People my age and younger where they're still, having to grapple or coming into contact with literature activism that says, no, you don't have to choose, right? But even with that awareness, there's still, when you're in queer spaces in particular, I mean, I'm 50. And so my being in queer spaces in the early 90s is not the same as queer spaces now. So in terms of, just the whole kind of QT pop, queer, trans, people of color, that was not the thing going on. But there were Black lesbian spaces and places, and people of color spaces and places, and organizations like Women in Life organization, which is an organization founded by my partner in 1993. They had not only parties, but a magazine and many cultural events. And there are all kinds of organizations that were happening like that. United Lesbians of African Heritage, YOLOA, Affinity Services in Chicago. There are places where Black lesbians would gather and be, and where we weren't choosing between any of it. And now, I think with social media and legalized gay marriage, it's just so great to see like young people, like kids, like 10, 11, 12, be clear about who they are. And I would offer that many of us were clear, but we knew we didn't have the freedom to be clear. And I think about that in terms of this being the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, right? And like my birth is like in tandem with the anniversary. Wow. And thinking about those predominantly trans women of color who really had an uprising that created space for all of us, and yet they still have to fight to have space for themselves.
So where are you looking these days? Where do you feel like tides are shifting, or you're going for new paths forward?
I mean, we're definitely talking about sexual violence in ways in which we weren't 25 years ago. I think now tides are shifting around talking about how do we respond to sexual violence and recognizing that prison isn't the solution. And, when I made I wasn't using language like transformative justice or restorative justice. I don't know if I'd even say community accountability if I was using that language. And when I look at the film now, 13 years after it was made and all that, like in many ways, that's what I'm calling for. Like, I don't advocate for prisons at all. Like, there's this whole section on like accountability at the end. It's interesting because I think that was some of the critiques in the early days.
Really?
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, I think, and then also, and it's interesting because No came out before the first Title IX case was applied around sexual violence. So initially people were like, this isn't real. It's like campus, sexual violence. It's very interesting in terms of like thinking about where I was with No and where we are now. But all that to say that I'm really inspired by the work of organizations like Survived and Punished, Creative Interventions, Insight, Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, Impact Justice. So I keep talking about the cohort because it's such a great group of folks who are doing this work with Ignacio Rivera, who has a project called the HEAL Project. And what they really talk about is how we have to talk about sex and sexuality to end sexual violence, that we're not talking about sex. And we have to talk about it because we're talking about addressing something where the act of the violence involves sex, and that we're not informing our young people, we're not informing adults, we're not talking about any of this work. And so Ignacio's doing a lot of work around healthy sex education in a way that's proactive, not shame-based, that's really beyond like good touch and bad touch, because that still is putting us in like an adversarial or fear-based thing, but to really talk about it in an affirmative way so that then if we can be positive and affirm and embrace our sexuality, all of us, then I think that can empower us in terms of how we respond, if we do tell, when we tell, how we react to when we're hearing about it, all of that. There's so much blame and shame and guilt that is just wrapped up in all of this work.
So much victim blaming too. It still blows my mind when that happens now. Like, why was she in that position?
Right. It's really, it's so real on that level, how that happens.
Well, is there anything that you want to touch on specifically that you feel like we haven't?
Well, I do want to talk about a gathering that I'm working on called From No to Love, From No the Rape Documentary to Love with Accountability, building on a movement, really celebrating the past 25 years. And while it is definitely about my journey, it is about the journey of so many others. First of all, no, nor love with accountability would exist without the contributions of many people. My work is in tandem with so many other people who've done and are doing incredible work. And then there's so much work that follows us. Like No is now subtitled in Spanish, French, and Portuguese, and just recognizing that Blackness isn't something that African Americans own. I am a part of a diaspora. And so anyway, when I say that this gathering, which will be held at University of Pennsylvania in October, is really to celebrate a culmination of work, not just know and love with accountability, but the work, a lot of which I've talked about, highlighted in this conversation and beyond. And so it's a multi-day conference, and really envisioning how we can continue to do our work to disrupt and end child sexual abuse. I really believe that child sexual abuse is foundational to all forms of sexual violence. I believe that we are taught to protect the family, and then by extension, the family just grows. So Bill Cosby becomes the family, R. Kelly becomes the family, not because they are a family, but we get attached to celebrity, right? And in institutions, they protect. And that's why the anthology is like dig up the roots. I think we have to dig up the roots of child sexual abuse. We have to, because those roots are feeding the tree, which creates the leaves and the branches.
Yeah. So you envision a world around the corner where there's no...
Yeah, I envision it, but I want to see it in my lifetime, but I know that this requires a lot of work. We're talking about centuries of violence. And so to think that we can just undo it so quickly means that we will come up with really hasty decisions and frameworks that won't last. And so I'm on the intergenerational plan. Just like I've seen so much progress in the past 25 years, and I hope I'll be here for at least another 25, maybe longer, in good health. So I see this as a continuum, right? And like, because I know that we're going to end it in one generation, we're going to stop it. Of course, I want that, of course. But I also want us to be mindful, and I want us, in the words of Audre Lorde, to be deliberate and intentional, like thinking about what does that mean? And then if we don't have prisons, then what does that look like? What it tangibly look like? How do we do that? And if that's going to require work or services, how do we create that? We're talking about abolishing the criminal justice system or abolishing prisons, then what do we have in place? And I am all for that, but I want us to take that time.
Yes.
I think about my friend and comrade Walida Marisha, who is one of the co-editors of Adrienne Marie Brown of Octavia's Brood, which is an anthology of sci-fi writings by people of color in the tradition of Octavia Butler. And she always talks about we have to use speculative fiction, and that is what marginalized communities have done, that when enslaved people said, my people will be free, they didn't see where we are now, but they knew that, and they carried it for generations. And I don't even have children, but my children's children will not know what sexual violence is. They will read about it and go, oh, people used to do that. And that's what I want. That's what I'm working towards.
I believe in that universe. I want that universe too, and I'm so grateful that you're helping manifest that. Thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes. So my film No is available on Vimeo on demand, but you can learn about No on the website, knowtherapedocumentary.org. And then Love with Accountability is at lovewithaccountability.com. And that's where you can learn about the anthology. And then I'm on Twitter and Instagram at Afrolez, AFROLEZ.
And I just want to say your Instagram account, you do such a good job of using that platform to really educate and pack a punch, because I consistently stop and sit with your posts and really think about them. So. Oh,
thank you. Sometimes because I keep going, I don't know what I should, I'm like, maybe I'm doing too much too much writing and PSA, but I'm like, I will definitely post a picture of a meal or something, but I like to use the opportunity. So I'm all, and if you're on, Twitter, I'm not as consistent, but Instagram and Facebook, I'm fairly consistent with the message. So if you see it here, chances are it'll be there too.
We'll go find her.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to Aishah for taking the time to be with all of us in such a transparent way. I actually also learned meditation through Vipassana, and I just wanted to echo the way that she presents it. It really changed my life. I went for 10 days to Quebec. You get there, you put your cell phone in a box, you put any writing implements, pens, notebooks in a box, they lock it up, and you sit from 4 in the morning till 9 at night with breaks for 2 meals. At the end, they ask you to pay what you can or what the experience was worth to you. And yeah, it changed my life. It gave me a container to be disciplined in a way that I think I'd only experienced otherwise in the jungle, drinking ayahuasca. Those kind of practices, long distance running, they all have the potential to take you to the God within yourself. In the absence of distraction, in the void, cut off from all the habitual consumptive behaviors that I do to numb myself to the present, that's where I've come into deep communion with my own mind and done the work of understanding that I create my reality. And the more practiced I become at manifesting that understanding in my daily life, in my daily habits, the more empowered I become to show up to my life, to be love and forgiveness and accountability when it's hard. So if you don't already have a meditation practice, Vipassana is an awesome place to start. It's a rocket ship that can shoot you in 10 days so far out into your practice. I'm really excited. Next week, episode 32, we're going to hang out with Yasmin Saidullah. She's the author of Radical Dharma, and she picks up right where Aishah left off about what it means to change the world, to be an abolitionist, to manifest a just future, and how that really happens in the choices that we make every day. It's a good time to be alive, you guys. It's a really fucking scary time to be alive, but we're in the middle of so much rapid evolution right now, and we really have an opportunity to decide how we're going to participate, whether we're going to let it happen to us or whether we're going to help shape it. If you want homework this week, I think it's pretty clear. What does it mean to accept the fact that I have caused harm? And how do I proceed from there? That's what I'm going to be asking myself. That's what I have been asking myself. I have a friend who was starting out in AA about 5 years ago, and he told me at one point early in that, I think it would be a good thing for everyone to do the step, which now I'm forgetting the name of, where you take stock of your relationships and you call people who you are out of alignment with and you make amends. That might be what it's called, making amends. I want to give a little shout out to plant medicine here. I find plants like cannabis and mushrooms have been incredible allies in confronting the ugly parts of myself that I usually don't like to acknowledge. Mushrooms, especially LSD, I like to say they take me on a tour of my relationships and they show me the cracks. They're like, here, you got to be more forgiving. Here, you got to be patient. Here, you need so much more love here. And the benefit of doing that work under the guidance of plants is that they tend to be so much more compassionate towards me than I am to myself. So in that process of seeing where I'm coming up short, where I've caused harm, there's not an additional layer of self-shaming going on. There's context and tenderness, and the focus is on, okay, how do we move forward better? Not dwelling in the shame of, I can't believe I fucked that up so badly. So I just have to blast my deep devotion and gratitude to those spirits. They want to help in this work. I think plants are the most wildly, unconditionally loving spirits I've ever encountered. Life is such a teacher, and I'm so grateful to all of you that I feel and I see every day showing up to it. It does matter. This is how the world changes, and it's so worthwhile. So thank you.